Good morning, everyone. Pastor George here, and I have some fun history stuff to do with us today. So if you're into that, be excited because that's what we're going to be focusing on. So today, we're going to start off by reading this passage from the book of Acts about the spreading of the church in Antioch, and this is the kind of the big moment because this is where you're going to see the Christian message expand. And I just want to tie it in with what I'm going to be taking a little bit of time to talk about today. So, Acts 11, 19 through 26. Now, those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews. But there were some of the men of Cyprus and Cyrene who, on coming to Antioch, spoke to the Hellenists also, preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. The report of this came to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas to Antioch. When he came and saw the grace of God, he was glad, and he exhorted them all to remain faithful to the Lord with steadfast purpose, for he was a good man, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith. And a great many people were added to the Lord. So Barnabas went to Tarsus to look for Saul, and when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. For a whole year they met with the church and taught a great many people, and in Antioch the disciples were first called Christians. So if you want to know where we were first called Christians, well, right there. That's where they were first called Christians, in Antioch. And this is an interesting point because this is when the gospel is heading out of Jerusalem, right? That was the center point of where it started. With the death of Stephen and the persecutions that followed, many people are leaving. By this point, Paul has had his Damascus Road experience. You can see he's still referred to as Saul in this passage. And I'm going to just point out a little bit of the what's going on, right? Why this is kind of interesting. So the Jewish Christians, right, who are fleeing Jerusalem, they go to these cities in Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch. So Phoenicia is a city or an area on the east coast of the Mediterranean near Israel, but like northern part of it, farther from Jerusalem. Cyprus is that island off the coast, very picturesque place. It's in the eastern Mediterranean. It's just a big island that's out in the ocean there. And Antioch is a very, very important city in the ancient world. It lies on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. Right these days, it is in southern Turkey, barely. There's this little stretch of Turkey that extends down south, and that's where the city of Antioch was. I think it's all ruins now. I'm not sure if there's a modern city, but the one that this would have been taking place in is an archaeological site now. And they're speaking only to the Jews. That's just important because those are the first people that you would bring the message to. You see this over and over again in the book of Acts, that Jesus's disciples and the evangelists first go to Jews and then to Gentiles, declaring the good news, right? And this is for two reasons. One, because of the fact that they are of the people of Israel, right? And that they have the law. And so you would expect them to understand the things that you're saying. And as soon as that was rejected, then they would go to the Gentiles. And you see that happening here, right? And you see that some people, it says here, there were some of the men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who on coming to Antioch spoke to the Hellenists also. So Cyrene is in North Africa and Egypt. I think today it would be Libya. But back then, I think it was more kind of within the Egyptian sphere of things. Of course, all of this is in the Roman Empire. But you'll see that some of these Jewish Christians who were from these places, Cyprus and Cyrene, also are there. And they're speaking to the Hellenists. And this is important. So Cyprus and Cyrene, both Greek-speaking places. Cyrenaica was a Greek colony in northern Africa. Cyprus has always been, well, not, I don't want to say always, but for a large part of its history was Greek-speaking. So naturally, they are going to gravitate towards the Greeks, right? Those are the people that they've been raised around, and they speak their same language, unlike the people of Jerusalem, who might speak Greek and might speak it pretty good, but they're going to be more interested in the Jews that are there, right? And so they speak to the Hellenists, and this is one of the big first moments you have where people outside of this, and Hellenist, by the way, is just a kind of a classical, fancy way of saying Greeks, because the Greek word for Greece is Hellas, so that would be and so someone from Greek would be a Hellenist in kind of this older form, and so they're preaching Jesus to them, and then they believe, and then this comes to the ears of the church in Jerusalem, and so they send Barnabas to Antioch, and he sees that this is good, right? That these people are there, full of the Holy Spirit and faith, and a great many people were at it. And then Barnabas goes to Tarsus and gets Paul, and brings him to Antioch. And so Antioch is actually it's one of the first early centers of Christianity. It's there where they're first called Christians. And so this is a very important historical moment, obviously, because that's where we get our name from today, but also where we're going to see this morph out of being a Jewish only phenomena into a global phenomena, right? Because this is where it's going to spread outwards from here, which was always the plan, right? That was the idea. But I think that the apostles are surprised that it's happening so quickly, in a way. And that brings me to what I want to talk about today, because I think that as a early historical witness of what's going on, the book of Acts is very helpful for determining the history of the church, but we also have other sources that we use. Non-Christian sources are always helpful for us to kind of see, okay, how are other people reacting, or what are other people thinking? And one of the most important people that this was in relation to in the ancient world is this guy, Flavius Josephus, or as his Hebrew name was Yosef ben Mattityahu, right? And he is, as you can see by his Wikipedia page here, he was a Jewish Roman historian, and he wrote something that's very important. He wrote the Jewish War, and he also wrote several other things as well about his life and the Jewish people and their relationship with Rome. That's what the Jewish War is all about. And you can like, if you ever are interested, his other big work is the Antiquity of the Jews, which is kind of like a history of the Jewish people. But one of the most interesting things, which is in the Antiquities of the Jews, is a section that he has about Jesus. Now, Josephus was a Jew. He never converted to Christianity, but he is writing at a time. You'll notice if you're on his Wikipedia page, right, he's born around the year 37 AD, so only 4 to 7 years after Jesus is dead and raised from the dead. Right? And 100, he dies around the year 100. So it's during that time that you have a lot of these things happening. Now, Josephus would have been young when, for instance, this was happening, but he would have known people who were around at the time, right? It wouldn't have been hard for him to find sources that talked about this. And we have one of the most important things in kind of historical studies of Christianity is something called the Testimonium Flavianum, which is Latin for the testimony of Flavius. You'll see his he took a Roman family name. There's a lot of interesting things he could do with Josephus. But basically, after the defeat, he was in the Jewish war, where the temples, where the temples destroyed. He is basically enculturated into the Roman system, and he writes everything he has in Greek, and that's where we get it today. And it's in the Antiquities that he has a very famous sentence, and you can see it written out here. I'm going to talk about this book in a second, but I just want to read. This is how it's traditionally been interpreted, and translated. And so I'm going to read the traditional translation. You can see the Greek there on the left. It says, "And in this time there lived Jesus," talking about the time when Jesus was around. "A wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of miraculous deeds, a teacher of men who received truth with pleasure, and he led many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. he was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who at first loved him did not cease to do so, for he appeared to them alive again on the third day, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up until now, the tribe of the Christians who were named from him has not disappeared. So now you can see this where this ties in. A lot of focus on Greeks and Jews. You can see where this is a similar idea of what's going on with the Book of Acts here, right? Where you can see this other source lining up with it. Except this was a heavily, and I guess still is, debated passage about Josephus. Although this book and recent scholarship has started to turn things around with doing a little bit better job at translating this passage in the context of Josephus and his work. Because you'll notice, right, it seems like, he does say he was the Christ. And so you're wondering, and this is why many scholars, since the Enlightenment period onward, have actually believed that this passage is a forgery or has forged elements to it, right? That later Christian scribes saw this and they changed the words to make it seem as though Josephus was agreeing with Christianity. And they said, well, Josephus was Jewish. Why would he call Jesus the Messiah? Right? No Jews believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And all those that did were Christian Jews. And so why would he say that? And it's a pretty compelling argument. And that was what I was taught in school, right? When we would get to this in our church history class or in our New Testament classes where we're talking about the gospel witnesses and things like that, Josephus's testimony would be brought up and it would be said, well, we have several other early sources. Josephus is one of them, but honestly, it's clearly been tampered with. That's what people would say, right? The Christians later went into this, so you have to take everything that Josephus says in Antiquities with a grain of salt, that he didn't really maybe write a lot of this, or maybe there was a core that he did, but that was changed later. And that's what I really believed up until a few months ago when this book came out. So this is a book called Josephus and Jesus. It's by T.C. Schmidt. It's published by Oxford Academic. It's free online, so I can post it in the thing if you want to read it. It's 300 pages or whatever, and it's historical works. If you're not into history, maybe just read the introduction, and if you're interested, then you can move on. But you'll see it's new evidence for the one called Christ. So notice that the language that he uses there. So Schmidt is going to offer his own translation to this. In it, he basically used, the idea was that there's a lot of words in here that only appear once, and that coupled with the idea that it seems to speak positively about Jesus as the Messiah, it can't be Josephus. But what interesting thing Schmidt did is, this is the good use of artificial intelligence. I'm always kind of tech skeptical, but this is the good use of it, right? Is he uses algorithms and programs to scan all of Josephus's work, see how often he uses unique words. So Josephus had a massive vocabulary, and he's writing in Greek, which is a vocabulary-rich language, right? How many times have you heard me or another preacher just describe the words for love that are used in the Greek texts, right? That they have several different variants. And I'll show a good example of this that he brought to mind, which I'm not aware of because I'm just not as knowledgeable and as good a scholar as this guy is. But basically, he had a algorithm go through, and it marked all of the areas where Josephus had unique words. And this passage actually has no more instances of that than any other passage of Josephus. So he first went, okay, well, that argument doesn't really hold water. But what do you do with the parts of it that seem to say that Jesus is the Messiah when he's not, from Josephus's perspective, right? So this is the translation he gives. You'll notice that the word he changes here are words that he changes in order to show us the importance of maybe how we translate some of these words. And so this is what it says. It says, "And in this time there was a certain Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, a teacher of men who received truisms with pleasure, and he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was thought to be the Christ, and when Pilate had him condemned to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who at first were devoted to him did not cease to do so, for on the third day it seemed to them that he was alive again, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of Christians who were named from him has not disappeared. So this is a very interesting way. You could see the subtle differences. The earlier translations make it seem as though Josephus is much more certain about some of these things in favor of being, oh yeah, this is definitely what's going on, rather than approaching it from a more skeptical angle, which is definitely Josephus has and is borne out in the Greek text itself. So he points out that the Greek word tis there, certain, right, that there was sometimes that word is left untranslated because it doesn't, it just is to show who's being spoken about. Here, right, he wants to make sure that it's focusing on that this isn't just some Jesus, but this is a certain Jesus, as in the one that is being talked about, Jesus of Nazareth, right? And he points out that incredible deeds, sometimes translated as miracles, but the word here, and he brought this to my attention because this is one of those Greek words where there's several different words, right? Miracle is a Greek word, but that's not what Josephus uses, the word he uses. He uses this word paradoxon, right? Paradox. So he does paradoxes. This is maybe the easiest way to do it, and obviously this isn't paradox in a philosophical sense of two, or scientific, where it's like two, how do you hold two contrary things or whatever. This is a Greek word that is used for miraculous things that happen of uncertain origin. And so Josephus is saying, he, by accounts, he did these incredible things, but were those of demonic origin, or were they of heavenly origin? And Josephus is kind of leaving it up to the reader to decide, but it seems like the very fact that he would put that in there is saying, weird, that he kind of is able to do these things, maybe not a very positive word to use, not miracle. If he wanted to use miracle, he could have, but he uses paradoxon, which means that it's an odd, like these are an odd source for Jesus to have these powers, right? He doesn't know where they come from. The thing that you would maybe use of holy men, but not maybe within the mainstream, but not inherently evil either. So yeah, interesting. A teacher of men who receive truisms with pleasure. So you can see that it's this is slightly different emphasis than the earlier version, right? A teacher of men who receive the truth with pleasure. So kind of like that he is teaching truisms. And this is basically a way of hinting that to many, right, Jesus' teachings were in line with what the Torah was saying, but that he is challenging a lot of the authority that's there, right? And he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks, so you see that there's lots of cross-pollination there. And this is most important, like he was thought to be the Christ, the one called Christ, right? That this is kind of where this book is the biggest change. And in the Greek, right, you'll see he adds this mistabra itav, and that's actually not Greek, that's Aramaic. And the reason he adds that is because in other early copies of the antiquities that we have additional things not found in Greek, but in these other versions that actually clarify what Josephus is saying here. And mistabra itav is an Aramaic way of saying he's thought to be. And the Latin translation says the exact same thing, that he was thought to be the Christ. And that completely changes the way that we interpret it, right? If we say he was the Christ, well, that's a very strong statement from Josephus. But if, like in other places, according to Schmidt, that this happens in Josephus's writing, and these other sources, that this is just one of Josephus's way of saying people thought this about him. Doesn't mean that it was what Josephus thought, but that other people thought he was. And so he says people thought he was the Christ, and that makes it pretty clear that he's just reporting what early century Christians believed. And he points out that, continues to go on and say that those who were at first devoted to him did not cease to be so, for on the third day it seemed to them that he was alive again, given that the divine prophets had spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. Right? So he's explaining the Christians and why they believe the things that they believe, right? He says, on the third day it seemed to them that he had risen again. Josephus doesn't put his hat in that ring, but he's saying the people that worship this guy, that follow Jesus around, believed that he had risen from the dead. And of course, like, is this a dunk, right? Is this Christianity is true sort of thing? No, right? That's not really what I'm intending by saying this, although I think it helps, as you always need outside sources that kind of confirm the biblical witness and testimony. But the reason I wanted to talk about this was because I think it's a pretty interesting change in historical and biblical scholarship when it comes to Josephus, and that this is like a mainstream and good scholarly source that's talking about it, that backs up the historical testimony that's found in the Gospels, but also challenges maybe the way that a lot of people thought about Josephus. Because it also teaches us what the early Christians really believed about Jesus, that he was the Messiah, and that they were devoted to him, and they believe that he had risen from the dead. Right? Josephus can't really, outside of having Christians and people who don't believe it, isn't able to verify that, right? Because these two groups are going to be arguing, but he's at least saying that they believe that they did this, right? So there are some people who go as far as to say, well, that's a later thing that was made up, right, by Christians, right? But no, this is a very early source that's confirming that this was a very ancient belief from Christians. And so the majority of this book, it's 337 pages. And actually, a lot of it does talk about his methodology and things like that. But he also wanted to use a lot of it to examine the sources that Josephus could have been using. And so he has a whole section on the first men, who were the first men among us that Josephus might have known and talked to. So some really interesting history there. If that's something that you're interested in, you can check it out. I'll link the place where you can go and get this free PDF of it online, or you can go on Amazon if you want to support him, and you can buy the book from the Oxford University Press thing on Amazon, or from their site, maybe, if you want to read the praise from other scholars. Knock yourself out. All right, that's all I wanted to talk about today, because I think that is just an interesting and important piece of scholarship that came out. And as you know, I'm nerdy about that type of stuff. I'm nerdy about history, nerdy about languages, and so I hope that you found that interesting. I will see all of you on Sunday for worship, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Peace out.